Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next Dev and Design panel, First Steps into a Larger World. In this one, we're going to be specifically focusing on the design philosophies and the process that brought us to the release of Star Wars Shatterpoint. So just a heads up, there are no spoilers in this. We're not going to be looking at any cards. This is really going to be a deep dive into dev and design philosophy, what we think about, the process that we went through, and everything else. It's going to be a good time. Hopefully you stick with us for that. And we're just going to kind of walk through memory lane. We're going to discuss what worked, what didn't, what we learned, what we wish maybe we had known at the start. And yeah, we're just going to get right into it. So let's just go ahead and do introductions really quick because I always get yelled at, even though this is like midday 2. And our names are right below us. And we sat in the correct order.
It's true.
But
I mean, I haven't really confirmed that one, but I think we sat in the right order. We did! Yay! You got a thumbs up. I am Will Pagani, Development Manager.
I'm not doing myself. Go ahead.
I'm Michael Plummer, Senior Game Developer.
And Lead Developer for Star Wars Shatterpoint.
And Lead Developer for Star Wars Shatterpoint.
This is Shilwick.
Shilwick!
He has a title.
Chill Schmick.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
It is.
It's a good
It's
title.
a good title?
It
It's a
is.
good title. It's actually, I think it's wrong on the lower thirds, but director, not a head.
I won't
don't
say
know what
that.
the difference is.
I won't say that out loud on the live stream.
We
I
can't prove
Well,
that it was
that's
I
good.
did. Look at Ann. Look at her. What are you doing to me?
It's what was on Teams.
Okay, I mean,
Never trust teams.
that's fine. What do we complain about all the time? I believe it's teams.
It's true.
Anyway, so on to the actual part of our show.
Shilwick, the creator of Shatterpoint.
That's correct.
Ooh,
Thank you, Chad.
I'd like to meet that person.
Yes.
So we're just going to start at the beginning and effectively like where were the origins of the game. And really, we've talked about this a little bit, but the fact of the matter is that once we had Crisis Protocol, our first game, up and solidly running, we were offered the opportunity to do a similar skirmish-style game with Star Wars from our fine overlords at Asmodee. Obviously, you know, there's a lot of considerations that go into taking on a new project, but the opportunity to work on the Star Wars galaxy and to, you know, kind of take what we had done and learned with Crisis Protocol and apply that to this incredible, you know, the incredible Star Wars world was super exciting. And for me, one of the things that I was really intrigued about and I've talked about before was the idea of being able to do a very combat-focused game that also used combat as a narrative, that had storytelling in it. And so that felt like a very good opportunity to kind of dive in and start looking at some of those philosophies and take ideas and inspirations from other games that I had played in the past and kind of focus them in and then see what those ideas would launch and spawn in Will Pagani, who was here at the time. We hadn't brought on a Michael J. Plummer yet, but you were not too far behind.
Not too far.
So, like, the ideas behind that were definitely there. And then, obviously, you know, we wanted to craft the theme and kind of run with that stuff. It was an interesting time for us, and the idea of, and I think this is a big one that we always talk about, is not doing the same thing again.
Yeah, that was a really big part of it, right? We had made Crisis Protocol at this point, and we didn't want to do that again.
We'd done it once.
Like
it was time for something different.
I did that. So like that game was, I'm not going to say done, right? But like, because obviously it's not done, it's still progressing. But like, we didn't just want to like reskin a game or any game, our game, someone else's game, into just a Star Wars game. We wanted to create our own, very unique, very specific Star Wars game. And as you said a moment ago, you had that thought of like lightsaber duels as kind of the main portion of it. So that was kind of the starting point.
Yeah, I think the you know, the big thing is there's always going to be touch points that you always go back to, right? So, you know, you're pretty much guaranteed to have some kind of randomized element. It's likely going to be dice. There are systems that don't use dice, but dice are, I think, like dice quintessentially are important and fun in the game. Rolling dice is always exciting.
For sure.
The idea of using the templates and the range tools and stuff from a player experience and kind of what the game's potential audience was made a lot of sense, especially when you start talking about these distractions. So there are, you know, you always have like these similar ingredients. Everyone wants to use like the same salt, the same kind of like spices.
More cooking with this guy.
More cooking. Look, that's just how it is. You're throwing all that stuff together, but you're also innovating and changing stuff. I'm curious to get your kind of memory of, because when you got brought on, we never mentioned that we were working on this project.
No.
So like, I don't know. I think at the time we were talking about, we've taken on these different games. We have the Star Wars ones because that was right after the transition from Legion X-Wing Armada to us from Fantasy Flight Games, and so we were looking at expanding the team, and then you come in. And we had talked about Crisis Protocol, we talked about the other Star Wars games, and then we're like, hey, but what about this?
Yeah, I remember the question you asked me when I accepted the job is, you'll be coming in to work on the Star Wars games. Is that okay with you? And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. No big deal. And on my first day, I came in and you showed me the miniature for Asajj Ventress. And I was trying to play it cool. And I remember I kind of stood there and I looked at it and I was like, yeah, it's pretty neat. And as I walked out, I just got this huge grin on my face. And the next day I got to come in and play the game. And I fell in love with it immediately just because I really loved the combat trees and the interactivity of when I swing at you, more happens than you just take damage. And from that moment, I was in.
Yeah, and I think, I'm interested in like that first impression of the game because like Pagani and I had been working on that for quite a while. We'd gone through multiple iterations before you even saw it, but I'm curious if you remember like your takeaway from how different the experience was, what surprised you, what were you like, what are they thinking?
Yeah, it's so hard to remember all of that because the game has changed so much from that first time I played it. Goodness. I think for me, the combat trees were immediately like, yes, this is super cool. Initially, I wasn't sure how missions were going to work in it because of...
Well, neither were we.
Well,
to be fair.
Yeah, like, that's true. But
that was a journey we're going to talk about.
I know. But that was like kind of my biggest takeaways. Like the mechanics here are really cool and everything like happens and it's kinetic and there's action, but now what? Honestly, like at that point in the development, it was like, there's a great skeleton here, but I don't know what goes on.
And at some point, someone wins.
Yeah, and winning is great. I love that.
Even like when you came on, I'm pretty sure that we still had rounds in the game.
Yeah.
Like
for sure.
you went through the round, so everything had to activate. Then you moved out, and lethality at that point was probably high enough that you could actually remove characters fairly soon.
Yeah, pretty quickly.
Because we had, we're going to talk about all these different journeys, but.
I'm also pretty sure the supportings were two cards.
They might have been separate at that
They
point.
were separate.
Since Pagani wanted to go down that road, and then we snapped back.
Look, something
Never
don't
let you
work out.
forget. I was right at the start. It's one of the rare times. So then you came on, and we kind of moved forward with that process. So initially in that initial design, right, we had the idea of the order cards being tied in, the randomization of the order cards. Those were really big pillars for me.
Yeah.
The combat trees being like really effective. The initial design actually had a really weird thing with the dice. When you have an idea, you want to go all in on it. And for me, one of the things I was really fascinated if we could make work, spoiler alert, we couldn't, was that
but we tried.
When an attack happened, both the attacker and the defender had a chance to succeed and do their combat trees. So the original design was attacker rolls dice, defender rolls defense dice. If the attacker boffs the roll and the defender actually had more successes, they would get to get on the combat tree. Yeah. To add that element of like, hey, there's a riposte, there's stuff like that. Talk a little bit about some of the things that you thought were interesting, some of the things that you were terrified about. Just give the initial before Mr. Plummer came in. And those early days, kind of like, where was your brain going with it?
I mean, to me, the scariest part of making any game is missions and scenarios, essentially, right? Like, what are the players trying to do? Because I think it's relatively easy to make a combat system. We'll talk more about the perhaps botched combat system, but it did get us where we were going, so botched may not be the right word, right? But, like, the one that never made it.
Yeah.
But I'm just always terrified of what are we going to do to make the players play the game? Right? Like, just rules for like how to punch each other, or how to blast each other, or throw things, or whatever. Like that's all very mechanical and relatively easy to make in terms of this is easy to understand and easy to execute, and hopefully balanceable and that kind of stuff. That's a new word for all of you at home.
Balanceable. Yeah.
Balanceable.
You got to be able to balanceable it.
Before I go too far off that, well, you go ahead.
Oh, I mean, like just to bring it into a food metaphor, so that
Oh, yeah.
Chick
So
understands.
So I
it,
can
yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
I'm getting lost here.
Yeah.
Too much death
So,
talk
like,
going on.
You know, you can make amazing lime jello
Yeah.
and fantastic chocolate chip
I don't think
cookies.
anyone's ever made fantastic lime jello, but continue.
All right, but you can make fantastic lime jello and you can make fantastic chocolate chip cookies,
Yeah.
but you should not suspend the chocolate chip cookies in the lime jello ring. That will never be
I am
good.
positive there's a jello recipe out there from the 70s where that happened.
I'm sure it is too.
As long as it doesn't involve hot dogs,
But
we're going to be okay.
But that's how I think about what you're saying with, like, it's easy to build a combat system. It's easy to, like,
Yeah.
figure out the mechanics of how things work. And you can have all those things, but if they don't go together, it's not going to be good.
yeah.
Yeah, and to me, a lot of that is built in scenario play, right? I'm really big on scenario play personally, and I think it is one of the most important things in games. But before we get to that, let's talk about the combat tree stuff.
Yeah.
So you had opposed dice rolls. You did have attack and defense dice still. They
Yep,
weren't
we
the same
always
dice.
had the split dice.
And you had the chance to essentially riposte and attack back when you got attacked. And there were a lot of problems with that. One, it kind of took forever. Like, it took a long time. So the game dragged out.
The time amount to resolve it was very high. And I think even where we wound up, as we'll talk about, right, where the complexity and the time of the game is spent is in that combat tree.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So
but
having to do that twice per attack is a lot. And then we also ran into a lot of situations where, like, man, I got this really cool Jedi. I'm like, oh, well, my clone troopers are activating. I have no interest in attacking that Jedi. If I attack that Jedi, he's just going to stab me, right? So then you have non-interactive gameplay going on. So, like, that's not good either, right? And that came out very, very quickly. And it came out a little bit in the current live game with deflect and stuff, right? So, yeah, a lot of Jedi can deflect blaster bolts, and they can do all of these things. But if you put it on all of the Jedi, clone troopers become useless. Because every time you shoot them, you take 2 back. There's 2 guys, you take 4 back. Like, it's just non-functional. It's non-starter if you put it on all the Jedi, right? So when we were building out the Jedi, we were like, oh, is this person exceptionally good at deflecting? Great, they can have deflect, right? Because basically all Jedi can deflect blaster bolts. It's the people that are actively great at it that got the rule.
And deflect, I mean, and I think initially, right, deflect really became kind of the light side force user versus the riposte. Damage back in melee was more on the dark side characters or the more Sith style characters.
Yeah.
And you start to define kind of like places like that. And it becomes unique and interesting. And then it also originally, like with the combat trees and everything, one of the big things was we knew that there were combat trees. Coming up with a list of what abilities you could trigger from the combat trees. That original list was really long because you kind of throw everything at the wall, you see what works. So we had the shoves, obviously, that was a huge thing. We had damage. There were originally abilities that would allow you to flip other people's stances. Important to note that, or your stance, because it's important to note that every character or every unit in the game had a double-sided stance card.
Yep.
So I think even when you played,
The
your
very-
clone
as the
troopers
Veil
could
Talon.
flip back, and your 501st clone troopers could flip back and forth. All the secondaries had a flip. That was another thing that eventually we got to where it was like there was too much for a player to really have to focus on. And so we streamlined that by leaving it on the primary characters who are kind of the stars of the show. You want them to feel powerful. You want them to have choices. And then the supporting cast really just kind of does what it does and focuses in.
And I don't think we lost a lot by cutting that, right? I think we still get a lot of the flavor of those supporting characters and the secondary characters. And then in some cases, have we shown any non-primary character with a double-sided stance card? They exist.
They do.
Now we have.
So
that does exist in some places, in very specific places, right? Instead of just everybody. So
I think the other thing that's interesting to talk about here, as we moved away from what you were talking about, where the character can attack back, the way that expertise work really changed a lot. Starting then.
Yeah.
Because when I came in, expertise existed, but it was in a much simpler form than it is now. If I remember correctly, each character just had expertise, and it didn't matter if it was ranged or if it was melee. It's just kind of what they did. And then from there, we kind of grew into the idea of, well, we can make these characters work differently and make the stances more interesting if they have a ranged and a melee and a defensive, and we can flip those around and move them, and you can put that's when the idea of like putting the effects and not just dice results into the expertise came in, and we started to be able to really shape what the characters do, how they react in combat, because it is telling that story.
The training and the unique nature of it was definitely part of that expertise, but the other side of it, the development side of it, was the idea that you can only have so many areas of randomness, and one of the places where we wanted to reduce that randomness, which is an entirely different approach than you see in Crisis Protocol, was the dice variance.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And so Pagani can talk all about his love of hammering down that
Spreadsheets.
dice variance.
Yeah, in a game where you don't get to pick the order your characters activate in or your units activate in, I'm flipping between terms here, I apologize. In a game where you don't get to do that, when you don't get to pick who activates and then they also flub a dice roll, is the worst, right? Like, you're just like, oh no, I didn't get what I wanted and the dice didn't work out. So dice in Shatterpoint are very consistent. And that's not to say that you'll never flub a dice roll, right? Because you will.
Yeah.
But,
I've seen Plumber roll dice on stream.
On stream.
yes.
In the playtest room, it's different.
It is. Your dice are very performative when you're playtesting.
It's true.
They're shy of the cameras. But yeah, so by having lots of, or I guess few failure faces, blanks or failures, however you want to describe them. We describe them as failures so we can put symbols on the cards and things like that. But they're essentially just blanks. Is good because it means if you're rolling 8 or 10 dice, you're very likely to get 6 or 7 results that are not blanks, right? And then how we addressed that for different styles of character is through expertise and that kind of stuff, right? So we have the criticals that obviously go through no matter what, and you have hits, and then you have expertise, and we can modify per character and even per stance what those expertise symbols represent and can do on the table. And that was, I think, a major breakthrough in the dice and how the characters worked, because now, whereas the original one, which was just a pretty linear expertise, like 2 expertise is a hit or whatever, whereas we started having the different expertise charts, we can then like modify, oh, Darth Maul is really great, so he has damage in his expertise chart. He doesn't even need results to do damage. Whereas the clone commandos, or not clone commandos, clone troopers, there are clone commandos, they have different sets of results in their expertise, so they can do different things with the same dice result, which let us get really cool and granular with a lot of different
And
things.
I think it works exceptionally well to kind of differentiate the power levels between like the supporting versus the primaries and everything else. One of the key aspects to that system working, though, I think, was the evolution of crits and what a critical effect meant.
We had critical blocks.
We had critical blocks at one point. In the original kind of like design, there were basically criticals and critical blocks could block criticals. Then there were strikes and blocks and everything else. And we kind of slowly distilled down to the idea that what if crits just always went through? They're guaranteed. At that point, putting them into the expertise charts then allowed you to have consistency with certain characters. Like, for example, Anakin Skywalker in the core set, every expertise he basically rolls up to a certain number is like a guaranteed success. So now you know he's going to walk down those charts. Then you go back and you look at the charts and you say, okay, what is this character going to do consistently? So the first 3 results, and this is something that I think you really got into as you got into the game, and you can certainly talk about, is like how you define, or how we came to define how good combat trees looked versus like bad combat trees.
Yeah, I have a very distinct memory of like the first meeting where we sat down, because we'd been playing for a minute. Excuse me. Pardon me. We'd been playing for a minute, and we had to sit down to be like, okay, what makes a character good? Because we were all having these arguments about like, this is the best character. No, this is the best character. I love playing this one. Okay, but are they good? And when we sat down and we had that talk, and we kind of we broke down a system by which we would evaluate what the characters are, which I'm not going to share with anyone. As far as like,
wow. 11 secret herbs and spices is 11 secret herbs and spices.
Well, I don't need to go into all the various discords later and like see them breaking down what's a good character by our metric of what's a good character. But we kind of came up with that plan of like, what do we think is essential to making a character work and function and do what it's supposed to do?
And I think it's important also to say like, good doesn't necessarily mean like powerful.
Yeah,
right? Like what makes this character useful or work or that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Right?
So, and we had that, and then I made this massive sheet of like, this character hits this many and this successes and gets this here, so they need more of this and they need more of this, and if you flip the stance XYZ, I went deep dive, which is a thing I don't normally do on that stuff, and it was so fascinating for me, and I really like the thing that kind of came out of that was interesting, and I remember talking about Will with this as we did it. Pagani, I should say. There's
You
two
can
Wills
say
here.
Will,
How
it's
dare
fine.
you?
I
Look.
did talk to both of you about it, but the idea that the number of dice you roll doesn't matter as far as like what you can do. That's all tied
Yeah.
into the combat tree. We can give you 30 dice, and you're never doing more than 6 damage.
I think that was that idea, and it was an unintentional consequence of the combat tree. But the idea that the combat tree is because you can't wrap around, which was always in the design doc, stops, like it ends, right?
Yeah.
And like you said, you can roll 20 criticals, but the fact of the matter is if you only have 4 results on your tree, you only have 4 results on your tree.
Yep.
And the cap of damage that we could define, right? Looking at a game like Crisis Protocol, your damage can go as
Yeah.
high as the dice number you can get to, right?
Times 2.
Times 2. Well, yeah, you can
If you roll
take your
10
max
dice,
plus,
you get 10 crits in that.
and then get
You
10
get
more
10 more
successes.
dice. Yeah.
So there's not a limiting factor. There's a huge spike potential there. Whereas
It's incredibly high variance.
yeah, and
Incredibly
again
high.
by design, right? That is
Yeah,
where
absolutely.
because you have so much control in that game where you choose which characters you activate in the order that they activate. Where's the random luck? Where's the monkey wrench in the works? Because what we don't want is for it to be mechanical. Like the idea I think behind all the games that we make and that I think we enjoy internally, which obviously transfers in, is that I want to interact with my opponent. I don't want to play my own game of solitaire versus their game of solitaire and see how it like meters out. You need things where things don't go according to plan, and now you have to like be like, okay, what's he doing? What am I doing? Where are we going to go with this?
I mean, as the saying goes, limitation breeds creativity, and
Absolutely.
part of that is that when we look at the way that we can build characters in this game, and if we say like, you know, this thing makes a character good and useful and playable, and then we look at the character and say they shouldn't have that, then we need like we're limited in that factor because we can't make them do infinite damage.
Right.
So we need to figure out something else that is good at what they do, right? Like we can't just make someone that comes in and hits things really hard because that limiting factor exists. So I think that really helped propel how interesting the characters are and like how far they move, how wild their abilities are, because the power level of characters in
Yeah.
Shatterpoint is huge.
Yeah, I think we've mentioned this once or twice before in different like venues, but one of the really unique things that we eventually got to with Shatterpoint after things got figured out is like the amount that you can push a character is really high because you can never as a player confidently maximize all they can do, right? You're tied to the order deck, you're tied to random activation, and sometimes it comes up Millhouse and you're like, I got everything I wanted in the exact order I wanted. I am a god among
never happen again.
among force users. But you know, that's like winning the lottery. And so the idea that you have to work around stuff and then looking at characters and saying, okay, every character's activation has to be meaningful, but you can never guarantee when that character's going to activate. So you just naturally push the power level to make sure that they can do stuff. It's really weird, but fun.
I have a slight tangent
Do it.
thought.
Tangent.
that I want to
Go.
go.
Love it.
I mean, we're here for philosophy. There's no road.
That's true.
I mean, I have an outline, but we're like so far off it at this point, it doesn't matter.
That's fair. I don't think we ever made, like Plumber said something a moment ago, and I was like, could we make a character that did infinite damage? I don't think we ever did that. Like, just have a character that's just like, I attack, you get a wound, right?
No, we did. I mean,
I
Anakin's original ability
Was just, it
was
just
it-
wounds them
if
immediately.
he
right?
wounds you, you gain an extra wound. That was I'm going to
Okay.
finish this.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
the original.
Yes.
That was the original thing for Anakin's thing was if he dealt a character a wound, he
And then
could
he-
spend
yeah.
for it, and he would just give you an extra wound.
But what I do remember is Luminara
Oh yeah.
and
yeah.
Barris both had this at one point, so 2 characters in the same squad, was their heals were remove all of your damage and a wound.
Yes.
And an injury, right? That didn't make it, but that did exist.
it was pretty crazy.
that did
Um,
exist.
And then like talking about like the randomness in the order and stuff. There's a comment in the chat about Shatterpoint cards. Having the Shatterpoint card also be a thing that felt really great when you drew it, regardless of when you drew it. Again, not the whole idea behind Shatterpoint and its design is that you as the player do not have control over what your characters are doing. It is
Well, you have control over what, but never
what
when.
they do and not the when. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
better way to put it. So even though the Shatterpoint card gives you that opportunity to say what is good at this time, the point of the Shatterpoint card, because of how the entire game was envisioned to work, is not to let you break the whole system.
Correct.
It's simply a moment where you're like, oh, based on the current situation and information I have, I now get to pick what I think is the best choice. And I think that's really important to maintain the value of the game. If you could just pull your Shatterpoint card anytime you wanted, it would add that level of control, which would then be a limiting factor on, I mean, it would obviously break everything because we're bounced around that in a different way. But
You remember original Kalani that could just start with any card in reserve?
Yep.
it's true. Well,
And
it was
it
just
just-
him in reserve. It was just him in
No,
reserve.
at one point it was anybody. And that just, the whole game was ruined.
It was pretty wild, for sure.
I mean, we even had that discussion though, because that's where the idea of being able to shuffle the Shatterpoint back in came from.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I remember like 3 games in a row, I drew the Shatterpoint as my first card, and I was like, we can't do this to people. Like, absolutely
This
not.
is the worst.
No.
It's true.
No.
Yeah, you used to not be able to reserve the Shatterpoint card.
Yeah,
at
it
all.
was just like you draw the Shatterpoint first, and well, that's what you're doing.
Well, and
which
then-
isn't terrible,
Yeah.
but the Shatterpoint is supposed to be like
Yep.
the turning point. That's like the pivotal moment, and the first turn of the game is rarely the pivotal moment. So giving people some chance to put that back in their deck at a cost felt right, because as we were making the game, the randomness in the order deck and not being able to control things and not have that level of perfect control was so important that there had to be a cost to put that Shatterpoint back in, but
Yeah.
you also had to be able to do it.
There's
I
a-
remember we did like all sorts of stuff with reserving the Shatterpoint card.
Oh,
too.
yeah.
You were like, you put it in reserve. We're like, nah, no, that's not going to work. This gets back to the same problem if I can just do whatever I want.
Just do whatever I want.
Put it 3 cards down. Nope.
Nope.
Now you know exactly where it is. You can just do whatever you
Put it
want.
on the
right?
bottom,
Put it on
same
the bottom.
problem.
Awful. Like,
Yep.
takes way too long to get there. You just like, so
That-
we went
I-
through
I remem-
so many different iterations.
I
on
remember
how
when
to
we
fix
tried
that, right?
shuffle it in and then draw it, and like the first
Just
time
rip it.
shuffled it in, immediately drew it
Drew
again.
right
That's
away.
terrible.
Yeah, that was super fun.
Oh boy.
Yeah,
That was-
Memories.
Oh, very much like those kind of like those lessons that you learn, and then of course, moving beyond just the combat trees and how they functioned, I think one of the really fun kind of evolutions was action economy in the game. So the original design doc simply said you can't do every action more than once.
Yep.
Some of this was based on the fact that I think we wanted players to have to make tough choices, and we wanted to kind of limit the amount of movement. And this goes back to talking about how do you make players engage. And in a lot of times in scenario play, the best move sometimes is to just like get into the corner.
Yep.
If you're ahead and that's how you're going to score points, then that's what you do. So how do you slow down characters? As the missions kind of developed, but also as we looked at making abilities, and so many of those initial abilities were so useless, like on those cards, because you just don't know. So you're like, well, I think this might be good. I think this might be good. This could be interesting. And then distilling down, hey, you know what makes these characters really interesting, what makes them very fun, is the idea that they have things that break their action economy. They can get free focuses. They can especially get free moves. The tactic abilities and how those developed was so satisfying as you kind of like chip away at the boring rock, and then you get to like the gold underneath.
I think
Yeah,
figuring out tactics was like that was a big moment.
Well, this is a great topic to talk about. I think, right, is when you don't let players pick the character to activate or the unit to activate, right? And you just say, hey, you're activating XYZ. If that character is not in a position to do something cool, it does not feel good for the player, right? They're like, okay, well, I drew Luke Skywalker. That should always be a yay. But if there's nothing for him to do there, that's never a yay, right? It's like, oh, now he's going to go stand on this point. Okay. Right? But so as we created the tactics and we created a lot more abilities, as you said, like we had Luke Skywalker's like, oh my gosh, this guy can do everything. He could stab people 3 times. He can heal everybody. Like, he does all this great stuff. Cool. If you don't need any of those abilities, he doesn't do anything, and you can't pick when you need those abilities. So you have to give very generalized abilities that are always useful. So you'll see that one of our design philosophies for characters is they will always have something on their card they can use every time they activate, right? And whether that's a tactic, whether that's an ability, whether that's something else, right? Like, they'll always have something that they can do. It may not be the best thing that they can do. It may not be the most powerful thing that that character can do. But they'll always have something they can do to affect the game in some way, always. Because if you don't have that, nobody will play the character.
Yeah, it's tough.
So,
for sure.
so that one, and then that leads into tactics, right?
Yeah.
You don't get to pick the order. You do get to pick your tactics, right? So if Rex goes, clones get to follow him, right?
Well, and the other,
Like-
one of the other big initial design goals, and I think this like fed into the tactics discussion and how they turned out, was the idea that, you know, when one character activates, it still gets to affect the rest of the squad. To bring that unifying effect
Yeah, it
where,
brings that word together,
like,
right?
they're going to move, like if you take Commander Rex and Clone Troopers, they're going to follow Rex's lead. He's going to be able to like command them in some way. And developing that throughout. And that was interesting because of how squad building developed.
Yeah.
And the original idea was that squad building was far more fixed than it turned out to be, with the squads being immutable. So
Yep.
we would build, you know, the squad, and then that would be it. There was no player choice. There was no
There were no points.
there were
There
no
was no
points.
customization.
Yeah,
there was
it was just
nothing.
like pick 2 squads, and those squads are always fixed. And then the squad itself kind of became a de facto character, and its whole package was like locked in. And I think as we moved forward and had more conversations with our partners at Lucasfilm and stuff, they were like, "Oh, I don't think you need to make everything like fixed. You can add in player choice. We're very comfortable with that." To a level where they were just like, you know, if players want to mix and match eras and characters, like we're pretty okay with that. Like it's the player's choice as long as you can always play canonically, you know, or the game can be presented in an accurate fashion to the media. It's very good. And then once we kind of started playing with, okay, well, now what? Now that we can break this stuff up,
Yeah.
what does that mean and how does that affect stuff? And I think the great thing is that we had a good foundation because the tag system was always in there to promote you to play squads that were together or that had similar tags so you could spread out your abilities. Now you could just mix and match within. And I think that was a huge moment of growth and excitement for the game because all of a sudden we really got to explore kind of all the wildness to it.
And I think what that did that I really like about the game is that it doesn't punish you for not playing to canon, right?
Yep.
You're not punished for doing that, but you're incentivized to play the stuff that goes together because that's how the tags work. That's how the systems work. And of course, like if you're a person that doesn't care about the canon as much and you just like the mechanics of the game, you think it's fascinating to you, there are lots of fun places where the tags start to intersect and you can build these cool, interesting lists that are like just entirely mechanical and you would never dream of seeing it on the screen, but you would.
Or maybe
because
you
it's cool.
did.
Maybe you
Maybe you
did.
did.
But I really love that both of those styles of list building exist and are valid and fun to do.
Absolutely. Pagani, as the math guy at the start, walk us through the nightmare that was figuring out lethality. Originally, just for heads up, I believe Anakin had like 24 health,
Yeah.
and we were like, you just got to cheat.
Oh
through
yeah.
it.
Yeah, then we were like, that's a literal mountain of tokens.
It wasn't great, no.
Like,
but
yeah.
you could get through it and eventually kill him.
yeah, it was this whole thing of like, we learned a lot from Crisis Protocol, right? About the day's mechanics and things like that. Those didn't work. We tried something similar to that in Shatterpoint. But it went back to that, like, well, if you can't do anything while you're injured, then you might just sit on the table for 13 card flips or something and just not do anything. You're like, well, Anakin's always doing something, right? So, like, he's got to be able to do stuff. So that was, like, so we had a lot of discussions around that. And then we had a lot of times where we had things like Anakin that had the ability at that point to attack with full dice 2 times, which I think he actually has now, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
he's one of the
he
few
does
that
that.
doesn't have the
He
dice
can
limit.
spend 2 for I'm going to finish
Yeah.
this and whack twice. That's kind of his unique thing.
And then we had problems balancing that because if you have 24 hit points and Anakin can do 20, that's a problem. But everybody else only does 8. Like, oh, now Anakin is just by far the best character in the game, right? So we had to essentially add breakpoints that you had to check in at, right? And we knew at the beginning where the game was very combat focused, we didn't want it to be highly lethal because in the shows that this is based on, Clone Wars, things like that, even if someone is defeated, they kind of like fall down and they have their moment. And
they'll be
then
back next week if
they'll
you
be
don't
back
see them.
next
But
week,
you
right?
never
Like,
see a body.
Yeah, right. So like we know that these characters are not dealt with
Yes.
in the shows and things
Even
like
if
that.
you get cut in half and fall down a ventilation shaft.
He's just very angry.
You're going to come back
Very
later because you're
angry,
so
okay?
mad.
Yeah.
Very mad.
I'd be upset too.
But only on the
fair.
inside.
It's fair. Yeah.
But yeah, so we knew that like these characters come back constantly. They're not constantly being destroyed in these wars and stuff. So that was important. Having these breakpoints allowed us to do things like Anakin gets to attack twice. without just blowing out the game and making essentially every other character worthless, right? Because if Anakin can do 20 damage, everybody else only does 8, 10, whatever. Like, you could play Anakin every game. He's literally twice as good, right?
Right.
So, like, how do we balance that? We can't. Like, that's just how that works. We really want this second attack on Anakin because it's very flavorful and that kind of stuff. So having the breakpoints in there lets us do this kind of stuff like Anakin and these extra attacks where you can't just get like completely steamrolled in one activation or one round and then get removed from the table.
Right. And removing from the table is I think a huge problem and something we don't really like to see happen quickly, right? Because as a hobbyist, as a painter, you're going to spend your time on your favorite character. And I think everyone who's played these games for any amount of time has had that moment where you're like, here's my brand new thing, it's so awesome, and you put it on the table in other systems, and it maybe gets one chance to activate and then it's gone. And you're like, well, maybe next time, boys. Sorry. And you just kind of like, it's the new painted model syndrome, right? There are jokes about it. It's so prevalent. And when you're talking about these iconic characters, these people that are like, you want to see Anakin do cool things for most of the game, how do you solve that problem? How do you make the Alpha Strike not unimportant, but blunted in the way that like lets both players live out their kind of narrative that they want to tell and the game that they want to play?
And I think the order deck, not order deck, what is it called?
Yeah.
Order deck.
Yeah, you got it.
I got too many words in my noggin. The order deck also plays a huge part in this, right?
Yes.
Because if you can get defeated, if you're the first activation of the game and you run out there, and you're the bottom of the next order stack, the next order deck, you just die or you get defeated, right? Like,
you just really didn't get to contribute.
But didn't get to do anything, right?
That did raise the
So
question.
now you're removing a character from the table that hasn't done literally anything.
And I think that like the next natural step in that is it raises the question of like, okay, but if people can't be defeated, because there was a point in Shatterpoint where you just couldn't be defeated. Period. End of story. Like you were never removed.
You didn't have a durability. It was just.
And that raised the question of like, then why does attacking matter? So then all of a sudden damage means nothing, and it's all about shoves and conditions, purely 100%. And that's what brought us to the idea of wounding, like of what a wound means. It means you can't contest. It means you can't do this.
And your force cost goes up.
And your
too,
force
right?
cost
that was
goes
a big
up.
one as
I
well.
think
that was a big
the
one.
force cost was the final piece of that puzzle, because for a long time we had, once we got to that point, and this was like so many iterations, once we finally got to the point of like, okay, there'll be wound tokens and durability, and we had all that figured out, I think it was we were playing at the time, and you were just like, I could wound you, and I could stop you from like doing anything, but honestly, what's the value to me long term? And that started a conversation where I think you were the one who presented the idea of what if the force cost went up? And that became super meaningful because of how limited the force pool is and how important those abilities are, because they affect so much, whether it's your action economy or your ability to get more out of other people in your squads and all of that.
And I think that also does a lot for counterplay, right? Like, how can I counterplay a character that I can't defeat?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Well, if their ability costs 1 force, now it costs 2 force. That's a plus 100% increase, right? And now that it's also 2 force out of the 6 or 7 or 8 that you have,
Or
right?
4.
Like, or I mean, I don't know if they know that's possible, but that's possible.
I think they do now.
They do now.
They don't know how,
I would
but it is possible.
really suggest that. But yes, or 4. It is 50% of your total force for the turn to use one ability. That is dash, right? Like, so that's very meaningful, right? Like, so it became this like, and I think once that clicked, that was really when it was like, the lethality is figured out. We've done it. We figured out a way to not have characters get defeated, but fighting is still very meaningful for damage, right? Because now that matters a lot, but you still also really need pushes and shoves and conditions and stuff too, to be able to affect these characters in meaningful ways. So I think that was kind of the last key to that puzzle of like, what does a combat tree need on it to be good? Oh, it needs all of these things, and it needs them,
or some combination of them, right? And then you can you can specialize certain characters, which I think is also really interesting. You can have your more supporty characters that have more recovers, maybe some more moves, but don't have a lot of damage, and they play a role versus your like Savage Oppresses who just want to go like hit you with the laser sword and finish you off, right? Just nothing but damage, the Mauls of the world. And I think that's also really cool because it really lends back into, right, the entire game was built on this hope, this idea that we could create narrative combat and showcase character like personality and story through their actual attacks and their actions and stuff.
And,
Oh no! If you have one more thing, otherwise
I have
I'm
one
gonna
more thing
jump
here.
into. I'm gonna jump into missions.
Yeah,
I
just
got one more thing before.
Oh my
missions.
gosh!
all right. My one more
But
thing
you
is
had such a good setup with like what wounding and how it matters, and I was gonna be like momentum, but that's fine.
the last thing I'll say here, and it's something that dawned on me as we were sitting here having this conversation, is I think that as we were iterating and changing things, every time that we no longer had to answer the questions that the game was asking us in order to make progress, we needed to change something. So no one can be defeated. I no longer have to ask the question of who should I attack to meaningfully move the game forward. So we needed to tweak something to make sure that the game is asking you questions as you play. I think that's kind of the secret sauce of Shatterpoint so much, is that you don't know what's happening ever, and you have to answer the question.
Yeah.
Definitely. Something that we probably should have talked about a lot earlier,
Oh well.
but didn't.
Rewind us.
And can you push the rewind button?
No.
We're gonna
Nope.
start over.
Okay, start the whole thing over.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just
No.
turn it off. Turn it back on.
All right, give me a
Take
second.
two. Take two. Hello, everyone, and welcome to First Steps into the Larger World, a Star Wars Shatterpoint panel about dev and design. I'm your host, Will Schick. I'm joined by Will Pagani and Michael Plummer. What did you have to say?
So I think one of the most interesting parts about the combat trees, right, to me, in my head canon, is that like each step on the combat tree is like one strike of a lightsaber. Right, so like as the two characters are dueling and they're fighting, right? They're moving forward. That's why I like the little 1-inch steps when you push people and you shove people, right? Like you do those little things and you get them fighting and pushing around. I think that to me was like my like tingly moment, where like you would roll the attack and you're like, oh my god, I can see it.
Yeah, you can watch them, the
So-
push and pull, the ebb and flow, all
And
that
each
stuff.
step
Yeah.
being like,
Yeah.
like that to me was just incredible, and like that was really really the big one. So.
All right, now I want to dive into. You mentioned how wounding, a lot of things that were important. One of the ways that it originally advanced the game, though, was with momentum.
Yes.
Now it took us a long time to figure out what momentum was.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, it did.
And
And I mean the struggle in general.
We didn't even start with a struggle, right?
No, we did not.
We started
No.
very basically with a race of victory points.
Yes.
Very similar to
Score X points to win.
when you try, you imagine this new thing, right? We talk about the touch points, like
Yep.
what are you going to build this dish out of? What are you going to build this game out of? You
you
go,
want beef
well,
tonight?"
I know that this system kind of works. So we grabbed the Crisis Protocol system and we're like, we're going to slap all this stuff on. It's probably going to be a disaster, but it gives us a start.
Yeah.
And
Start somewhere.
I think we
Anywhere.
got through we started with you score at the end. There were extracts at one point.
Yeah, there were.
You used to be able to drop the football because then we came back to that lethality problem. We're going to talk about all that. And then we got to the struggle system. So this was like I think, if there was anything that you worked the most on, well, Plummer and I were focusing a lot on the characters and the feel and the flavor and some of the core rules. You were like just cranking away on missions, and then every time you'd come up with a new idea, we'd have to go back to the drawing board and redo everything.
I rewrote
You were
those
not my
missions-
favorite person during those like 5 months.
I
to be
rewrote those
honest.
missions every day.
Yeah. Yeah. I think at one point I actually was just like, I'm not rewriting these characters again until you tell me what the game is like.
I do remember that, yes.
And so for a while we were testing with things that were just wildly out of sync.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, we started off with secures and extracts. We hit the.
And it was like X number of victory points to the win.
Yeah, there was no struggle. There was no tug of war mechanic.
And it
anything
was
like that, right?
rounds.
It was rounds. We had rounds. So at the end of each round, for each extract you were holding, you scored X points. For each secure you were securing, you scored X points. Play your game. That was not good.
It wasn't. It definitely it didn't work with the randomization of the order deck.
Correct.
And the way that I think one of the big things was we talk about time and where you're spending your effort. Combat takes a while in this game to resolve, but it's fulfilling. However, once you start adding the concepts of rounds and everything else to it, you're just like, this game takes a long time. How do we streamline? How do we slow it down?
I don't remember
speed
when
it
this
up?
happened in the development of the game.
I mean,
But
it's all
there were
blurred
definitely
out.
times where it was like, we have been playing this game for 5 hours.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
What is happening? And this was before we had the tug of war mechanic,
Uh-huh.
where it's just like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, I remember one of the first innovations we had was, instead of scoring at the end of the round, and this came out of going through the deck, right? Like going through everything. And at one point, I think I mentioned in a playtest, I was like, well, why do we have rounds if you could just reshuffle the deck and keep going? Like, just get rid of the concept of rounds. And that was a moment where we're like, oh. And then I think from there you iterated on it and you were like, well, if we don't have rounds anymore, what if you just scored at the end of every turn? And then games ended by the third card flip.
Yep, that was not great. And then we were like, what if you just had to score 100? And then we were like,
And I think at that point but then
were some bad days back
conversation
then.
quickly the conversation quickly slipped around to, okay, but what if when scoring was a tug of war, right?
yeah, it essentially win by X.
If
right?
I pull the score points back, I subtract your points. Now all of a sudden the game doesn't end as fast. And then it was like, where's that balance?
Yes.
And then we
had the momentum.
Yep.
Which was
because it was like, well, this game could go on forever.
Literally.
Like, that's not good.
Yes. Do you remember when the zero space didn't exist?
Yeah.
It was like two little lines, and there was a little
Yeah.
zero down here, and then once it started, and then it just went back.
I think there's
do
like
you-
4 or 5 of my original like struggle tracker designs where I draw it out with pens and we'd use them forever.
Do y'all remember when if you put a momentum in the zero, you lost?
That
Because that was a bad couple days.
No, that was a cool idea until somebody got mad about it. Like, well, yeah, because we were
was,
like, you've run out of time, and now you've hit the zero.
Well, yeah, that was the
But
idea,
like,
right?
that was such a
It was
it was
really
such a
bad. It
just-
negative
it's
player
never
experience
felt
for the
good.
person who did
Yeah,
it.
it was never
that
good.
it was like, all right, we'll just get rid of that. So then it stopped at the
Well,
one.
that brought us back to the non-interactivity, right? It's like, if
Yeah.
I win this guy, I lose the game, so I can't attack this person anymore.
And
So-
I think what was really interesting about
that was my
discovering
idea.
discovering how
Strat's
momentum
asking.
worked, discovering how momentum worked and what it does that was really cool is that when you're winning the game, you better keep winning the game.
Yes.
Like it puts the onus on the player who's snowballing to continue snowballing, and that feels so different.
I really like. I think this was like one of those moments where we were playing and it became
Yes,
this
two
like
discussions, right?
it became that so exciting was when we were looking at the track and you were way ahead and I was like, how am I going to pull this out? But then you were sitting there being like, I don't think I can win. I think you're gonna win. And we had an argument for like 10 minutes about whether like who was going to win. And we played it out, and I don't even remember how it ended. But it was not like there was a discussion.
and
There
it
was
wasn't
play.
even the thing I
It
do
wasn't
where I say I'm
predetermined.
going to lose
Yeah.
every game. Like I really thought
Like,
I was going to
I'm
lose.
pretty sure you were like 2 away, and I'm just sitting there being like, I can't come back. But the fact of the matter is that because of the way the system works, because the loser or the losing player currently fills up that momentum track.
Yeah, I
it's
think
like
the momentum
it-
discussion is two
it
pronged,
pulls
right?
you back in.
It's the wounding people, it's your momentum. So that is one play direction you can go
and
to head toward
obviously,
victory.
like adds damage being back is as important.
And it adds
compounds
force,
like everything
slows
else
down their
into
action
it.
economy.
It does all sorts of stuff. Is fighting people now, and once again, one of the pillars of this game was we want people to fight. But we also don't just want it to be like, I defeated all your guys, you lose, right? Like, so we had this scenario that was super important. So you have the defeating people to get momentum, and you also have the comeback mechanic. I remember just like sitting, staring at a wall for like 8 hours, being like, how are we going to get a comeback?
What's the snapback?
What's the
For sure.
snapback?
And part of that came out of the 3-stage struggle thing.
Yes. There's definitely part of that there. But I think the big one to me, I think picking the map is obviously very important.
Yep.
Right? So that was kind of like a last little one that got added in the end. But to me, it's the momentum stopped on your opponent's half, or the struggle stopped on the opponent's half, you get a momentum.
Yep.
Yes.
And that to me was the like light bulb moment of like, oh.
Yeah, it just means you have to do just enough until you can like give the knockout punch.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. You're
Like,
you're
you
not.
can rope a dope a little bit, and then once you see your moment,
well,
give
it's-
them the uppercut.
It's like you gotta hang in there until you have your moment. And I think that is very Star Wars.
Until
Yes.
the Shatterpoint,
especially
perhaps.
animated,
Yes.
like especially animated Star Wars, right?
Absolutely.
Like,
Yes.
Absolutely.
being right on the verge of defeat, but then turning around
And
at
then-
that pivotal
yeah.
moment, and it ties back into the Shatterpoint. We're gonna run out of time. We're not gonna cover our whole thing. I don't really care. I do want to talk about your process or the process that led to the split 3 struggle system, because I
Yes.
think that was something I never expected to see. And yet, I think that it is one of those pillars now. You know, we talk about the original pillars of the design doc, and then you talk about pillars that organically form that you
Like
can't imagine the
sequence.
game without.
Sure.
And that 3 struggle format, I think, became huge. So walk us through how that system evolved, what made you think of it, how you two worked to like create that in the game, and what it meant for kind of the overall system.
So in the beginning, it obviously didn't exist. We were just playing one struggle, and the priority objective was really big. The priority objective, I think, is another pillar of the game, right? It's something that adds another element of chaos to the game that the players cannot control, that they have to answer the question of.
Yep.
And if you notice, the priority objective is missing in the first struggle, and I guess we're just all in on spoilers in the stream that's not supposed to have spoilers. The second mission is also missing on the first struggle. I believe that is correct, Plumber. Yeah, Plumber can back me up there. And the reason that is missing on the first struggle is what the priority objective does is it ends the struggle. Right? So like if you have 4 points that are active, you can score 4 points. If it's now 5 points, that's a lot of points. And on average, right, both people take their home points, the ones that are safe for them, and then they're fighting over 1 point. So you're scoring 2 or 3 points on each turn. If you're scoring 4 versus 2 points because of a priority objective, that person is going to win very quickly. Right? So the priority objective became a way to end struggles. It didn't start that way. It started as a way to end struggles very quickly in struggle 1. And then we were like, this game took 10 minutes.
Yeah.
What if we played best out of 3? Right? Like,
I think one of the like really satisfying things, and this might just be a thing that Pagani and I love doing, but one of our favorite things when we play a game is we finish the game, and if we look at each other and immediately go, let's re-rack. Like, let's play again. Like,
Absolutely.
that's such a good feeling to be playing a
Absolutely.
game where you just want to play again immediately. And the idea of just playing the game 3 times in a row just felt very fun. To be like, oh, I lost that one, but I'll get you this time. And then proving it that you can do it, or failing miserably. Like, that's
Both of which
that's
are exciting,
satisfying. Yeah,
right?
it's exciting to get trounced sometimes.
and I think there's, and then to me, the final step of that was the like, oh, you don't take all your miniatures back and like
You don't
redeploy,
actually
right?
play.
You don't actually play 3
separate
games. It's 3 scenarios using the same ones. And I don't remember whose idea it was. It doesn't really matter. But the like, what if you don't reset? And we're all like,
Yeah.
I mean, to be clear, I don't think we ever played the game best 2 out of 3.
No,
I think
no,
the
no.
conversation was happening in a meeting, and it was like, well, it would be really good if this game was kind of like best 2 out of 3 because it happens really fast. How do we extend it? And it was like, well, what if you just played best 2 out of 3, but you just kept going?
Yeah.
And for me, from like a narrative and story perspective, one of the things that I know you didn't intend out of best 2 out of 3, but that I loved is that it's a 3-act story.
Yes.
And like, so I was all
Which
in.
is very
I was
Star
like,
Wars, right? They always
yeah.
have their
I mean,
three
it's
sign
just like
acts.
the narrative story. Like you look at how an animated show is structured. You have the setup, the complication, the resolution, and I was like, make it work because that sounds amazing. Going back to the priority objective to tie it into something you were talking about before, as a really big, like one of the big development focuses, how do you force players to play the game? Right?
Yeah,
How do you make sure they're playing the game as it's intended to be played? Which in Shatterpoint is you're running around, you're engaging with your opponent, you're not like playing keep away.
Yes.
that
Which is why
priority-
tracks don't exist.
Yeah, that
Also, characters can move like this far.
that
so.
priority token, like one of the things I love about it is that it forces you into disadvantageous positions long term in order to gain short term advantage. That is probably really critical. So you're like, well, I don't want to send Anakin into the middle of my opponent's like strike team, but I also really want those 2 points.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna do that. It demands that players don't play conservatively, and I think
Yes.
there are certainly games. Star Wars Legion is one that I think there's a reward for playing conservatively. There's a reward for playing strategically. Shatterpoint was never intended to be that type of
Correct.
game. Shatterpoint
absolutely.
is kind of a crazy, super adrenaline soaked, like we're doing this.
Uh-huh.
Action's happening.
Yep.
Yeah, there's nothing to it. So I really love how the priority token also forces that or brings that to light in a way that feels very rewarding, but also makes you go, I'm not making the best choice.
I'm
if
making the
this
choice I
game
have
goes
to
too
make,
long,
right?
I'm making the choice that's going to get me the win, and I want to close this down quickly.
And it's also like you don't know what the best choice is. The fact that the priority objective is random is so important, because if it's not random and you know where it is and you know, top deck Grievous or Vader, you just plan them on that. And they're not going anywhere. So
Yeah.
making it so that the priority objective can indeed go somewhere is kind of what made it work.
And I remember we had a lot of iterations on it, right? It was, this is random. Oh, okay, cool. What if I don't score? Does it stay there? Yeah, okay, let's try that.
Yeah.
Oh, that didn't work. It just went off into Narnia, and then there it is. And nobody's getting it, so okay.
Now the game's 10 hours again.
Yeah, and like
Wow.
it just so, or like it's a contested point, nobody can score that point, so like you just kind of pass it back and forth. Like the character I picked, like so there's just a lot of stuff going on with the priority objective that I think really solidified the end game of Shatterpoint, right? Because the first struggle is significantly longer than the other two. There's no priority objective. It usually lasts at least a shuffle-ish. And then the other two can go very quickly. They can go in 2 or 3 turns
Or
each,
they
right?
cannot.
Or they cannot. But I think without that priority objective, they always go very long.
Yes.
And then we get into like the 3, 4, 5 hour games, whereas 5 hours is a lot.
It's a bit much
I'd
for a
say.
skirmish game.
A little bit.
So I think
sure.
I think that priority objective keeps the game length in where we want it to be.
Absolutely.
Basically.
Okay, so we didn't hit all of our lists, but we've given a lot of stuff for folks to chew on. So I just want to really quickly wrap up with our most important bit, which is current thoughts on the game since its release. Like, how you feeling? How do you think? What surprised you? What went according to plan?
Man, I'm really proud of how the game turned out. I think it's awesome. I think it's a lot of fun. The coolest thing for me has just been watching people enjoy it, especially people that have never played a miniatures game. I did not expect the draw of people who had never played miniatures before. And I see so many people saying, I'm just getting into my first miniatures game. It's Shatterpoint. Here's my painted Ahsoka Tano. And like, this is so cheesy and corny, but like, I'm a part of that. Like, I actually helped bring miniatures gaming into someone's life, and it's been the most important thing in mine. So yeah, that's it.
I like it.
You're up.
I mean, Plumber and I had a bet before the game released, which is, would the community sleep on Asajj Ventress? And I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I'm going to be controversial
That's
here.
the thing.
I think she's the best main character in the core set.
Ooh.
So-
Well, just the core set, though. I mean, they have a lot of other sets now.
I'm not sure what's released, so I can't say if she's the best character in the game. But she's up there.
It's a very safe answer.
Yeah, that is a safe answer.
Like,
I mean, I think from my vantage point, right, we knew going in, even before you got brought on, right? Like, when I sent over the design document and Pagani and I started talking, there was a lot of, are you sure you really want to do this?
look,
from one Will Pagani. Because the goal really was, like, to push ourselves, to see if we could make something that was innovative and different, and how many of the rules could we break? How many of the traditional rules could we bend to make something all in, not necessarily out of hubris to break them, but because those things interfered with the theme that we wanted, or at least the theme that I envisioned and wanted to see if we could do. And working through those things, you know, we got to a point where, I mean, I think we've had this conversation many times, but I remember the one where it was just like, we finished a game, like, that was a blast. Is anyone else going to like this? And like, it was a legitimate question.
Yeah, it was.
You know, like, you don't know, because sometimes you do things that are so crazy. Your fusion restaurant goes so off the wall.
like, 2 things nobody wants.
Are these flavors really good together, or are they just like, is it just a flash in the
It's like
pan?
Jello
Is it-
with cookies.
Yeah, is it lime Jello with chocolate chip cookies? I mean, people will buy it once just for the story, but they're
sure.
not coming back.
Right.
Because that's awful.
Yeah, I think if you want a real answer, right, it's the like, I think we pulled it off, right?
Yeah,
We
and-
did a lot of very different and very unique things in this game, and I think it created something that is cool and interesting and fun.
At the end of the day,
I think
I've been
we did it.
so excited to see people respond well to it, and like you said, to see new people come into the game, or to the hobby, who have never done it before, and be able to not only grasp, you know, the game concepts, but also to really enjoy them. So I think it's very cool, and it always makes me very happy to see people say, this isn't like anything that I've really done before. It's very weird, but I also really enjoy it. And to me, that is a great success, because what we do here is we want to bring fun into people's and onto their tabletops. We want to bring cool experiences to them, and to achieve that goal is like, it's a big sigh of relief, because it's just like, I like it, you know, we like it. Hopefully other people will like it. Will they get what we're doing? So it's been really wonderful. And with that, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive philosophical content. Hopefully, you know, it was interesting, and maybe you learned a couple things. We will be back for the Star Wars Shatterpoint designing characters tomorrow. So if you're looking at some exclusive looks at some stat cards and some other things, we're going to be talking about how really drilling down into character design and development, and how we take these iconic people from the media, put them into the game, what we're looking at. It will build off a lot of the concepts here. Otherwise, you can tune in. Dallas Kemp's going to be painting the Warrior Falls right next. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.
Bye!